Hello, I am back again and I'm ready to read you chapter 7. And this chapter is entitled In King George the Fifth. It is a book written by Kenneth Rose, and I found it on a website called thriftbook.com. And this is post World War I Britain. So let me just bring in some pictures. Post World War I Britain. Sorry, I usually have all this prepared, but because it was quite different times, and I think people don't understand that there were quite a bit of changes, and it's after war for World War I, and it, to me, in this day, we forget about this war. It was a horrible war. They called it the Great War. There was trench warfare. It was a different time, and it was so terrible that I really do believe that some of the ministers in England, when they're talking about Neville Chamberlain, some people might know this more than I do, but when they're talking about Neville Chamberlain and the whole ministers during that time, they really just wanted peace. So they did not want to have another war like World War I. They really did not. So it was just, anytime you have war, it's devastating. It leaves some lasting impacts from generation to generation. And this was our first world war all over the world. It had a devastating impact, obviously, on Germany later on. It had a devastating impact on the British people. And King George V, he was the monarch during that time. And, he was just holding his own and doing his duty. And I wanted to read that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different topics in chapter 7, and it's called The Restless Decade. So there's quite a bit to go over in this chapter, but if you're interested, I will read it aloud. I could not find it on an Audible Books, and I have a subscription there, so I'm just going to read it out loud because I just feel like people in the world need to understand George V and not only his personhood, he was just a quiet king, reserved in nature, doing his duty. And with the help of Queen Mary, he served 25 years and was not expecting to be in a war, have his country be in a war. He had very conservative values, but socialism and socialistic ideas were on the rise. There was a great deal of poverty and certain social issues were needing to be addressed. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and read. 2 weeks before the armistice, Asquith remarked to the king that the war had brought a slump in emperors which neither of them could have foreseen 4 years earlier. Russia murdered, Austria a fugitive, and Germany were on the verge of abdication. The king agreed that they were not good days for the monarchy. All the minor German rulers had lost both place and power. It's a fate which Princess May of Teck would have shared had those stiff-necked princelings not disdained her taint of Morganic blood. Within a little more than a decade, the thrones of Greece and Spain were to disappear, albeit temporarily. There would remain in Europe only those Britain, Belgium, Holland, Italy, the Scandinavian countries, and the unpromising Balkans. Not even the future of the British monarchy could be taken for granted during the aftermath of war. In 1922, looking back on the first 12 years of his reign, the king drew comfort from having through so many ordeals with only 2 prime ministers. That shows how sound this country is, he wrote. No other country in the world has got a record like that. Yet the republicanism, which has so unnerved him during the war, continued to flourish. At a meeting in Albert Hall, organized by the communists to celebrate the 3rd anniversary of the Soviet Socialist Republic, the name of the king evoked a wave of hissing. Stamfordham wrote to the Prime Minister a year later, "The king is growing more anxious about the question of unemployment during the coming winter. The people grow discontented and agitators seize their opportunities. Marches are organized. The police interfere. Resistance ensues. Troops are called out, and riot begets revolt and possibly revolution." King George V's ability to withstand such an assault could not be taken for granted. Now well into middle age, with impaired health and a shyness that continued to make every public appearance a trial, he seemed ill-cast as the symbol, much less the savior, of his country. The euphoria that had engulfed the king and queen in the moments of victory gave way to embittered introspection of a bereaved, impoverished, and restless nation. It was daring, but not appropriate of Asquith, when publicly congratulating the king on his wartime courage and endurance, to quote some lines from the 17th century poet James Shirley. "The glories of our blood and state are shadows, not substantial things. There is no armor against fate. Death lays his icy hand on kings." His purpose, he later explained, was to qualify them with a couplet from the same poem which he saw to be secret and safeguard the monarchy in testing times. "Only the actions of the just smell sweet and blossom in their dust." But could an unblemished family life and unobtrusive dedication to duty alone repel the tide of republicanism? Might not a more positive effort be required to project the virtues of monarchy? The king himself regarded any striving for popularity with repugnance, and would refer to the press as "these filthy rags of newspapers." Nor were his private secretaries experienced in such artifice. They lived by habit rather than design, by precedent rather than compromise. They were men of conservative tastes, set in their ways. Stamfordham, listening to a post-war debate on India in the House of Lords, heard his contemporary Lord Parmore inadvertently refer to Her Majesty's government. This, he confessed, had touched him, as I fancies his mind, like mine, often wandering back to the much despised Victorian period. In a sense, Stamfordham's mind had never left it. The principles that had guided him in the old Queen's reign would as well serve her grandson, not least in defending the royal prerogatives against the growing pretensions of parliamentary democracy. In any case, courts are by nature resistant to change. Lord Esher, entrusted with the editing the girlhood diaries of Queen Victoria, printed this extract from 1838. Lady Lyttelton asked to leave, put on a spectacle for working, and Lord M. said, Her asking to leave showed her understanding of etiquette, for he said formerly nobody was allowed to come to court in spectacles or use glasses. That Mr. Burke, when he was first presented at court, was told he must take off his spectacles, and that Lord M said he remembered as long as anything that no man was allowed to wear gloves at court. At the foot of the page, Esther added an editorial note. These customs have never been abandoned and still obtain. When he wrote those words in 1912, King George V had already been on the throne for 2 years. Through peace and war, the court continued to be hedged around with quaint practices and traditions, though no more than in any other closed society, such as public school, a cathedral chapter, or a regiment of foot guards. There was, for example, its excessive discretion, which at Windsor one day provoked Sir Philip Hunloke, the king's sailing master, to confide to his colleagues, "There is a blackbird on the lawn, but for God's sake, don't quote me." Every royal pronouncement had to be cast in a distinctive language, the last purpose of which was clarity. If counselors of state were required, the sovereign appointed them, "of our most special grace, certain knowledge, and mere motion." During royal tours, municipalities were dressed with a vapid spaciousness exactly caught in Arthur Benson's parody. "This is a larger town than I expected to see, and more important town than I had anticipated. It seemed indeed so flourishing a place that in the future, when I heard the word progress, it mentioned, I shall think of Dewsbury." The royal vocabulary was rich in well-upholstered words such as gratified, distressed, and heartfelt. And there was a special usage for announcing an imminent royal marriage. A journalist who inquired whether it was true that Princess Margaret of Connaught was engaged to the Crown Prince of Sweden received this majestic rebuke. "Young man, I regret to find that you are ignorant of the very alphabet of your calling. Members of royal houses are not engaged, they are betrothed." In similar manner, we speak of the conjunction of elephants and the copulation of mice. There was one private secretary at Buckingham Palace who took a broader view of newspapers and their purpose. Clive Wigram wrote to a friend in 1917. He stated, "I think that in the past there has been a tendency to despise and ignore, if not insult, the press, which is a powerful weapon in the 20th century. I've been working very hard to get their majesties a good press, and have been to the press bureaus and other places. I hope you may have noticed that the movements of the king have been better chronicled lately." Wigram was by no means a radical at heart. He looked on conscientious objectors as absolute cowards. He labeled wartime trade unions as official shirkers and traitors, and he hoped that neither politician nor other civilians would become sentimental about casualties. But he did see that one was necessary of disarming republicanism was to present to the public with a full and accurate picture of the monarchy at work. His Majesty must get out of the habit of hiding his light under a bushel, he told Haig, to encourage the cooperation of newspapers. He wanted a well-paid press representative with an office at Buckingham Palace, and sufficient sums for propaganda purposes should be forthcoming. A full-time, salaried salaried press secretary was in fact appointed in 1918, but the office was discontinued in 1931, when press matters were transferred to the assistant private secretary and not revived until 1944. Through lack of foresight, Wigram believed several imaginative gestures had gone unnoticed. He thought it tragic that the king's wartime gift of £100,000 to the treasury had not been allocated to a scheme for the benefit of the working classes. And he was disappointed at the tepid response to a proposal that convalescent officers and their families could use the gardens of Buckingham Palace. In the future, he wrote, there should be well-publicized royal visits to industrial areas and closer links with labor and its representatives. More cynically, he suggested that the clergy should be invited to the palace in greater strength. Preachers propagate better than most people the gospel of devotion to the throne. Wigram shrewdly enlisted Archbishop Lang, one of the king's most intimate friends, a fellow conspirator, writing this letter to him in January 1919. I am very keen that all the old court and state functions, they should be revised and opened up to more classes of the community. People of all classes should have an opportunity of coming into Buckingham Palace and its gardens. I should like to see something started on the lines of the White House receptions. School teachers, civil servants, etc., should all have the entree. I go as far as saying that trains and feathers at court should be abolished. We have to look ahead, and it is quite on the cards that the next government will be a labor government. I feel that there is no place now for any duds about the court. Everyone must pull his or her own weight. It is ridiculous to think that at present there is no retiring age for court officials. There are many well over 70 who have no business to be there. The organization and inner workings of some of the department are puerile and pre-Victorian. Opposed to the reforming party are the palace troglodytes, who shudder when any changes are proposed and consider any modifications of the present court functions as lowering to the dignity and status of the sovereign. They are hard nuts to deal with, as from their long years of attendance they carry a good deal of influence. We are up against them, but the barriers have to be broken down if the monarchy is to live. The path of reforming royalists is usually delicate. Let there be too little changes, and the monarchy succumbs to republicanism. Too much, and the monarchy becomes a hereditary republic. A mere constitutional device, shown of awe and romance and color. Ponsonby had that danger in mind when in 1919 he told the Prince of Wales, I think there's a risk in your making yourself too accessible. The monarchy must always retain an element of mystery. A prince should not show himself too much. The monarchy must remain on a pedestal. 60 years later, Wigram's bold proposals are no more than platitudes. At the time, however, it seemed to him almost revolutionary to suggest that young ladies presented at court should abandon the trains of their shoulders and feathers of their hair. Those adornments, as it happened, survived until 1939. So much else of the Victorian monarchy. Lord M would have felt quite at home in the court of King George V between the wars. Anxious letters passed between Ottawa and London on whether the Governor-General of Canada could emboss a red crown on his stationery, a device of Buckingham Palace, instead of the gubernatorial blue. A lady of the bedchamber was allowed a 2-horse carriage from the royal mews to take her to and from her duties at the palace. A woman of the bedchamber warranted only 1 horse. An equerry was reproved for addressing an envelope, His Majesty the King. The correct style was simply the King. Although QueenMary was also to be addressed as Her Majesty the Queen. The twin daughters of Major General Lord Ruthven was denied admission to the royal enclosure at Ascot because they were actresses. Their father showed his resentment by refusing the KCVO traditionally conferred on general officer commanding London district. Lady Astor, invited to a state banquet at Buckingham Palace for the King and Queen of Romania, created scarcely less of a scandal by going up to the days after dinner and sitting in one of the 4 royal chairs for a gossip with the visiting queen. And always there were disputes about precedence. The Lord Chamberlain, the Lord Steward, and the Master of the Horse argued interminably about their places at court. Staying at Windsor, Winfred, Duchess of Portland, insisted on going ahead of the Duchess of Roxborough, whose rightful place it was, claiming that a former mistress of the robes took precedence of all other duchesses for the rest of her life. When the Allied prime ministers came to London in 1918, should the Duke of Connaught go in front of Lloyd George or Orlando behind Clemenceau, the German war, Hankey wrote, was a trifle compared with this. The monarchy nevertheless survived its burden of archaic practices, and with scarcely any of these artificial aids essential to totalitarian regimes, it continued to gather strength and confidence to the very end of the king's reign. Wigram, to do his justice, had misjudged neither the menace of the republicanism nor the inertia of court. He had, however, underestimated the nation's ability to recognize virtue in a humble heart. This grudging yet perceptive tribute to George V was written by Professor Harold Lasky, the very apostle of republicanism, soon after the king's death. He was identified with the spirit of hard work and personal sacrifice that had won the war. He established a friendly and considerate relationship with the first British Labour government. His family life epitomized middle-class virtues and avoided overt ostentation. He, the Queen, and the princes were identified with a concern, albeit superficial, for the problems of social and industrial warfare. The monarchy, to put it bluntly, has been sold to the democracy as a symbol of itself, and so nearly universal has been the chorus of eulogy which accompanied the process of sale that the rare voices of dissent have hardly heard. It is not without significance that the official daily newspaper of the Trades Union Congress devotes more space of news and pictures to the royal family than does any of its rivals. Stripped of Lasky's understandable sourness, those are the themes which illuminate the way ahead as we rejoin King George V in the closing days of the Great War. Okay, that is the end of that topic. And I am going to read the next topic in a separate episode. So, and that is called Peace of Sorts. I'm breaking each topic down by episode so that if you're interested, you have time to listen and it's not as long and lengthy. I know when I'm listening to Audible books, if I'm interested in a particular topic, I will take it chapter by chapter, but sometimes when you're listening, the 30-minute to 50 minutes, it can be quite long. So go ahead and look at the People's Profile. It's an hour long, and it's got a wonderful visuals of King George V. They've got so many key figures of other important people also. So